The dog didn't mean to steal it. He just hadn't eaten in 2 days. The crust still sat in his jaws when the baker yelled, and the bullet missed him by an inch. Nella heard the gunshot from inside the dry goods store and bolted onto the street, apron fluttering, heart pounding. "Poke!" she screamed, as her gangly black dog skidded around the water trough with the half-loaf clutched in his teeth. The townsmen were already shouting. Mr. Tiller, drunk as always, raised his rifle again. "Mutt's been thieving all week," he barked. "Time to put it down!" The street froze. Poke crouched low in the dust, tail between his legs, bread wedged in his mouth like he didn't know whether to eat or die with it. Nella ran toward him, arms out. "He's mine, don't—" But she was too far. Tiller cocked the hammer. The air seemed to thicken. Then, without warning, a figure stepped from the saloon porch and into the street. He didn't say a word, didn't shout or curse, just walked slow and steady toward the dog. His hat was low, boots caked in trail mud, and his coat looked like it hadn't been washed since winter. No one knew his name. They just called him the Mute, or that quiet fella. He never spoke, barely blinked. And yet, the moment he stepped between Poke and the rifle, everyone stopped breathing. "Get out of the way," Tiller snapped. But the cowboy didn't flinch. He looked down at the dog, who whimpered and lowered his head, then reached into his coat and pulled out a coin. He tossed it at the baker's feet. Then another, and a third. 3 silver coins for 1 half-stolen loaf. Tiller snorted and raised the rifle higher. "You think money buys a lesson?" The shot rang out. Nella screamed. The dog bolted, and the cowboy stumbled backward with blood blooming across his shoulder, his jaw clenched in silence as he crumpled to his knees. The town gasped. The baker dropped his apron, and Tiller lowered the rifle, suddenly sober. Poke turned back just once, whining from the alley's edge, before disappearing into the sagebrush. Nella ran to the cowboy's side, her hands shaking, pressing against the wound as he blinked at her with glassy eyes and lips that never moved. He had taken the bullet for a mutt who couldn't speak, and a woman he'd never even looked at before. He didn't cry out. Not when she pressed against the bleeding hole in his shoulder, not when the fabric stuck to the wound, not even when the town doctor arrived huffing with a bottle of whiskey and a pair of rusted forceps. Nella watched in stunned silence as the stranger sat on her kitchen floor, back against the wall, while the doctor dug out the lead like he'd done it 100 times. The man gritted his teeth, but he never made a sound. Not a groan, not a hiss. Nothing. When it was done, he took the bottle from the doctor, poured a splash onto the rag, and tied it tight himself. "Ain't natural how quiet he is," the doctor muttered, packing up. "Either can't talk or won't, but that bullet should have gone clean through that dog's ribs." He paused, looking at Nella. "You the one he was protectin'?" She nodded slowly. "I didn't even know his name." "No one does." The doctor tipped his hat. "Might be the first good thing this town's seen in months." When the door closed, she turned to the man still sitting on her floor. He met her gaze calmly, like pain was something he'd shaken hands with long ago. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but full. "For Poke, for me." He nodded once, a small gesture but honest. She pulled over a stool and sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. "You can stay until you heal, least I can offer." Another nod. No hesitation, no shame. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who didn't expect kindness but wouldn't waste it either. That night, she laid a cot by the fireplace and gave him a clean blanket. He lay down without a word, boots beside the bed, hat over his face. The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the wall, and Nella sat by the window, staring out into the dark. She hadn't seen Poke since the gunshot. He always came home. Always. Her chest ached with fear. She glanced back at the man on the cot. His chest rose steady. Alive, despite the wound. A stranger who'd bled to protect what others saw as worthless. She didn't know who he was, or what haunted him into silence. But somehow tonight, he'd spoken louder than the whole town ever had. At first light, Nella slipped outside barefoot, the morning chill clinging to her skin. The street was still. No wagons, no voices, only the faint creak of a windmill and the distant moan of cattle on the ridge. She knelt by the spot where Poke had been shot at, eyes scanning the dust for any sign. There, faint paw prints, uneven and scattered, veering toward the arroyo behind the church. She stood, heart pounding, and turned back toward the house, unsure whether to wake the man inside. But when she opened the door, he was already up, sitting at the table with his arm in a sling, sipping coffee with his left hand, like he'd always belonged there. Their eyes met, and she didn't have to explain. He set the cup down and rose slowly, favoring his right side. She didn't ask if he could ride. She just handed him her extra reins, and they rode side by side into the hills. They didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was respectful, steady, like a trail they'd both agreed to follow. She led them through the dry wash and up toward the juniper ridge, where Poke used to chase lizards and bark at hawks. After an hour, she saw it, a smear of blood across the sandstone, just beyond a gnarled bush. Her heart seized. She dismounted and ran forward. There, beneath the brush, was Poke. Curled in on himself, whimpering low, the crust of bread still clutched beneath one paw like a bone too precious to lose. "Oh, baby," she whispered, crawling forward, tears springing. "It's okay. I got you." The cowboy knelt beside her without a word, pulling a canteen from his saddlebag. He soaked his scarf and passed it gently to her. Together they cleaned the dog's wound, a graze to the leg, not as deep as feared. Nella held Poke close as he licked her chin, tail thumping once against the dust. She looked up at the man beside her, wanting to say something, anything, but again, there was no need. His presence, quiet and unwavering, was already the answer. They rode back slow, with Poke nestled in her arms, and though no words passed between them, she felt something unspoken building with each step, something sturdier than thanks, older than fear, a kind of trust neither had known in years. The town didn't say much when she returned. A few folks watched from their windows, others turned away. No one asked if the dog was alive. No one apologized. Nella carried Poke into the house wrapped in her shawl, laid him on the cot by the fire, and set down a bowl of broth she'd made before dawn. The silent cowboy followed her inside, slow and steady, his wound already seeping again beneath the sling. She turned to him, her voice low. "You need the bandage changed." He nodded once. She motioned to the chair, and he sat without resistance. Her hands were careful as she cut away the stained cloth, cleaned the fresh blood, and rewrapped the wound with cleaner linen. His skin was warm, the muscles beneath tense, but calm. He didn't flinch. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at him fully. "You keep helping people who never asked for it?" she asked softly. His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. Then he shook his head. She frowned. "Just the dog?" He shook his head again, her brow furrowed. "Then why?" Slowly, he raised his good hand to his chest and tapped twice with his fingers. Then he turned his palm over and held it in the air between them. It took her a second to understand. A gesture not of silence, but of weight, of memory, a burden carried too long. You lost someone, she said. He didn't nod, didn't blink. But something behind his eyes flickered. Grief, distant and worn like an old coat. She swallowed. Someone like Poke? He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather tag, worn smooth, shaped like a bone. She took it gently, turned it over. On the back, scratched faint and crooked. Ember. A dog's name. Heron. She saved you, Nella whispered. He didn't move, didn't have to. It was written all over him, this silent man who had once been loved by something loyal and small, who had bled for a dog because no one had bled for his. She placed the tag beside Poke and met his eyes. You can stay, she said simply. No one here's going to shoot you for remembering someone. And for the first time, he nodded. Not to her, but to the memory. To Ember. To Poke. To whatever came next. It was 2 mornings later when the first loaf appeared. Still warm, wrapped in brown paper, sitting quietly on Nella's doorstep. No note, no coin. Just bread. Fresh, soft, and smelling like something kinder than what the town deserved. She stared at it for a long while before picking it up and taking it inside. The silent cowboy was already by the hearth, tossing scraps to Poke, who limped but wagged his tail with new strength. She held up the loaf. Was this you? He looked up, brow furrowed, then shook his head once. Nella blinked. Then who? That afternoon, she saddled her mare and rode into town. The bakery was quiet, the windows smudged, the bell above the door half hanging from its rusted bracket. Mr. Tiller was gone. Run out or hiding, no one knew. But the boy who swept the floor looked up when she stepped inside. Miss Nella, he said quickly, brushing flour from his hands. I didn't do nothing. It was the boss. The bread, she said, on my porch. The boy nodded. He said it was penance, but he couldn't face you. Said someone had to give back what the town took. She didn't reply, just stared at the loaves cooling on the rack, golden and whole. That night, she sliced the bread into thick pieces and buttered them slow, one for herself, one for the cowboy, one for the dog. They ate in silence. Not the hollow kind, but something more peaceful. Afterward, she set the rest on the windowsill with a clean cloth. The next morning, it was gone, and a new loaf sat in its place. Every day it happened. A quiet trade. Bread for grace. Word spread, slow and sideways. Folks started leaving bits of food at Nella's door, sometimes a tin of coffee, sometimes a single apple. No one ever knocked. No one said a word. But she saw them. A town remembering what mercy looked like. Poke healed. The cowboy helped patch the roof. And each night, as the fire burned low and the dog snored beside her chair, Nella found herself watching him more. The man who had never spoken but had said more in silence than anyone ever had with words. And each time he caught her looking, he didn't look away. He just nodded. Once, like he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. The dog didn't bark much anymore. Not out of fear. Those days were behind him. But because silence had become a kind of language in that house. Poke had learned it from the man who never spoke. They moved in rhythm now, those two. Every morning the cowboy opened the front door, and Poke would trot out, circle once, then head down the lane to fetch the bread. Sometimes Nella watched from the porch, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, marveling at how a dog that once stole to survive now walked with the pride of a messenger. That morning, the bread was different. Wrapped with care and tucked inside the cloth was a note. 3 words, scrawled in pencil. Thank the man. Nella read it twice, her throat tightening. She stepped inside, held it out to him. He took the paper, studied it, then slowly folded it and placed it in his coat pocket. No change in expression. No reply. just the sound of Poke's tail thumping against the floor. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "You've done enough." He looked at her. Really looked, eyes darker than Riverstone, still and unreadable. Then he reached down and scratched Poke behind the ear, pulled something from his coat, and held it out to her. A ribbon. Frayed, red, wrapped tight with a knot at one end. She didn't understand, until he unrolled it. Inside a tiny scrap of cloth with stitched letters, EMBER. It wasn't just a name tag. It was part of a collar, part of a story. Her breath caught. She wore this? He nodded. Then reached for the fire poker and for the first time dragged it across the hearthstone, lines forming letters in the ash. Rain. Cold. She found me. His hand trembled slightly. She died saving me. Nella blinked back tears. "You haven't spoken since then?" He shook his head. Then he looked at Poke, who had settled beside the hearth and placed one paw on the man's boot, eyes raised in wordless trust. Nella understood then. Poke had chosen him back. In that little kitchen, under beams stained with time and soot, the silence finally felt full. Whole, not broken, not heavy. Just honest. That night, Nella didn't ask him to speak. She just set a third plate on the table. And he sat. And they ate. And for the first time, the house didn't feel half empty. It felt complete. The leaves began to turn brittle and gold, and with them came the whisper of things changing. The town had softened, just slightly. No one glared anymore when Nella passed with Poke trotting beside her. The baker, though still unseen, kept the bread coming. Others began leaving small parcels on her porch, nails, seed, fabric scraps. It wasn't apology. It was quiet recognition. The cowboy remained, not as a guest, not even as a patient, just present. He fixed the leaning fence, repaired the well pump, re-shingled the shed without being asked. He carved new steps for the porch after one gave out under his own weight. He did it all with the kind of steadiness you didn't notice until it was missing. And Nella noticed. Every time he walked past, shoulders relaxed, eyes downcast, Poke trailing faithfully at his heels, she felt the pull, not like lightning, like gravity, strong and slow. One afternoon she found him sitting in the field beyond the barn, sharpening a knife with the sun on his face. Poke lay stretched beside him, chewing a stick. She walked to them, knelt in the grass, and said softly, "I never asked your name." He didn't look at her at first, just watched the blade glint once more, then wiped it and slid it back into his boot. Then he reached into his coat, pulled a sliver of wood, and handed it to her. A carving, crude but clear. A letter M burned into the back. On the front, a small image, 2 dogs, one curled, one standing guard. Her fingers trembled. "M for—" He tapped his chest, then pointed at her, then shook his head. She understood. He wasn't offering his name because he wanted to be known. He was offering it because he trusted her to hold it, to keep it safe. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her fingers around it. He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes she saw the truth. He hadn't stayed because he needed shelter. He'd stayed because someone finally noticed he was still here. That night, she set the carving on the mantel. Poke rested beneath it. The cowboy read by firelight, a book she'd left open on the table. And in the quiet, the kind that wraps around people who don't need to speak, Nella began to wonder, not how to ask him to stay, but how to let him know he already had. It was the first morning in weeks that the porch was empty. No loaf, no wrapping, no quiet gift. Poke stood at the door, tail wagging softly in expectation, nose twitching toward nothing. Nella opened the door and frowned. "Maybe the boy was late," she said aloud, but her voice lacked conviction. The cowboy stood behind her, shirt unbuttoned to the waist, a towel draped over his shoulder, halfway through his morning shave. He didn't ask, but she turned and nodded. "It's not here." He glanced at Poke, then disappeared into the back room. Moments later he emerged fully dressed, his rifle slung across his back. Nella's stomach turned. "You think something happened?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. They saddled the horses in silence, Poke bounding ahead despite his healing leg, and rode toward town with the wind curling dry leaves across the path. The bakery was shuttered, the windows dark. The bell above the door hung still. Nella dismounted and knocked. Nothing. She pushed the door open slowly. Inside, flour dust lingered in the light like memory. A single loaf sat cooling on the counter. Forgotten. Unfinished. Then they saw the note, pinned to the flour sack behind the register, written in a shaky hand. He came back, Tiller, drunk and angry, took the boy's wages and said the mutt owed him. Said next time he'd shoot the dog himself. I couldn't stop him. Nella felt her blood go cold. "He's coming for Poke," she said, barely whispering. The cowboy turned without hesitation and stepped out into the street. Nella followed. He didn't run, but he moved fast, purposeful, toward the livery, where Tiller was known to sleep off whiskey with his boots still on. And there he was, leaning against a post, red-eyed and swaying, a pistol holstered sloppily, and a snarl curling at his lips the moment he saw them. "You got my thief still breathing?" he spat. "Mutt should have been skinned." Nella stepped forward, fury on her tongue, but the cowboy raised one hand. She stopped. He walked slowly towards Tiller, pulling something from his coat. Not a weapon. The carving. He held it up to the man's face, let him see the dogs etched in wood. Then he dropped it in the dirt. Tiller blinked, sneered, reached for his belt, and the cowboy moved. Fast. Sure, without a word he disarmed him, dropped him to the ground, and walked away. Still silent. But this time, everyone heard him. By noon, the story had spread like wildfire. Not from Nella's lips, not from the cowboys, but from the bystanders who'd watched it happen. No bullets fired, no blood spilled, just a silent man who disarmed a drunk with nothing more than steadiness and presence. For the first time, the town didn't turn away. They turned toward. Mrs. Ellery from the apothecary came by that afternoon with a tin of honey cakes. "For the man," she said simply, setting them on the porch without waiting for a thank you. The blacksmith stopped by hours later with a sack of feed for the horses. He fixed what needed fixing, was all he said. The preacher came on foot, hat in hand, and asked, awkward and sincere, would he mind if we prayed over the dog? Nella, stunned, nodded. Poke wagged his tail like he understood every word. That night, as the sun bled across the horizon, a knock came at the door. It wasn't a gift this time. It was the baker. Eyes tired, apron streaked with flour and sweat. In his hands, a fresh loaf, still steaming, and a second one wrapped in cloth with the shape of a bone burned into the top. "The boy carved it," he said softly. "Said he wanted the dog to have something that'd always be his." Nella took the loaves with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "He didn't ask for this. He never wanted anything." The baker looked past her into the cabin, where the cowboy sat beside the fire, reading with Poke curled against his leg. "That's why it matters," he said. "The ones who don't ask. They're the ones who remind us how far gone we almost got." When he left, Nella brought the loaves inside. She handed the carved one to the cowboy without speaking. He turned it in his hands, tracing the design with his thumb. Then he broke it in half and held out a piece to her. She took it. And as they ate, quiet, steady, side by side, she realized something had shifted. The town hadn't just tolerated him now. They'd seen him, heard him, without a voice, without a badge, without a name. And maybe that was all he ever needed, to be known, not for what he said, but for what he did when no one else would. Fall turned sharp, the mornings crisp with frost and the evenings long with golden light. Poke had healed fully now, his limp barely noticeable, though he still slept beside the fire like he remembered the pain. The bread still came, as did the kindness. Slow, steady, never loud. Folks no longer crossed the street to avoid Nella. They nodded. Some even smiled. But it wasn't about her, not really. It was about him, the man who had never spoken, but whose silence had named every wrong and every mercy in town. People started asking for him. Is he still around? Can he fix a fence? Would he come by for supper? And though he never answered with words, he always showed up. One evening, just as the last of the corn was harvested and the light stretched long across the land, a child approached Nella in the bakery line. A little boy, tugging his mother's hand, whispering too loud to ignore. "Mama, is that the house with the man who saved the dog?" The mother hushed him, embarrassed, but Nella smiled. "Yes," she said gently. "That's where he lives." "Does he talk?" the boy asked. "No," Nella replied, "but he listens better than anyone." That night, she told him what the boy said. He chuckled, soundless, breathless but full of light. Then he took a scrap of wood from the pile beside the stove and carved a single word into it. "Here." She stared at it. "You're staying?" He nodded once. And she understood that this place, her little cabin with its crooked door, its loyal dog, and its quiet, battered heart, was now his home. The town never learned his name. Not from her, not from him. But they began calling him something else. Something whispered with respect at the feed store, spoken over fences, written in letters sent back east. The Dog Man. It sounded simple, but it meant more than any of them knew. It meant protector. It meant witness. It meant the man who bled when others looked away, and for Nella, it meant the man who never asked to be loved, but was anyway. That winter, as the first snow fell soft and slow, Nella stepped out onto the porch with a loaf in one hand and a carving in the other. Poke at her feet. The man beside her. And peace, earned, honest, and finally quiet, settled over everything. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If you saw them aim at that dog, would you have stood in front of him too?